Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Drobo Broadcast Network. My name is Mario Blandini at Drobo, and today's session is all about VMware Backup and some specific approaches and architectures to protecting VMware virtual machines, not just the virtual machines themselves, but also the ESX/ESXi hosts. We are joined by special guest Jerome Boutaud, back with us on the Drobo Broadcast Network. He's a senior virtualization engineer at Acronis. How are you doing today, Jerome?
Good. Thanks for having me, Mario.
It's fantastic. We had a great session last time, and this time we're going to delve more specifically into backup recovery, being as agile for your VMs as the VMs themselves. To give you a little bit more background, backing up VMware can be done by most any software. You'd probably agree with that. But doing it the same way as you do for your physical servers may not be the right fit, and the backup that you choose may be best if it's technology that's designed specifically for virtualization. In this case, we're talking about VMware. So there are some new technologies that exist that can be used to deploy a VMware backup solution with disk-based backup and technologies that we'll discuss in this particular session. And you, Jerome, have been around not just long enough to see the virtualization happen, but back in the physical server days as well. So working for Acronis, being a leading provider of easy-to-use DR and backup solutions across all types of environments. Maybe you can give us a little bit more information on your background for the new listeners.
Yeah, so I've been around the backup and disaster recovery for about 10 years at this point, and the backup really has changed over time from a full physical approach for backup where initially it was really just a file-based approach and then it evolved into more of a DR-conscious approach, and now virtualization really enhances the disaster recovery and backup opportunities that you have so that you can minimize downtime, higher recovery time objectives, and be able to have a better disaster recovery scenario.
Cool. Well, as we go to the next slide, talking about VMware Backup from a small and medium business perspective, it does require a new way of thinking. I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts there. But reducing your backup storage utilization probably requires new tiers of storage as well and new technology. Using tape may not be the best thing for virtual machine backups, the way a lot of the service levels have been enhanced through live migration and other things that you can do with virtual machines. Folks are expecting more out of that sort of infrastructure. So maybe in terms of what a small and medium business might need around VMware Backup, talk about what's changed. What in addition to what they used to do with physical server backups are considerations that they need in terms of requirements?
Mm-hmm. So there is a number of things that have changed over the past few years. The first one, as far as storage, there is a lot of new options. In the past, people always looked at tape. The reality is tape can be a little bit of a nuisance with recovery, where recoveries are concerned. So there's a number of things you can do. You have to think about potentially using physical storage, whether it be a USB disk or a NAS as far as an approach to backup, or maybe even a cloud scenario where you send your data offsite to a cloud storage provider so that your data is offsite. On top of that, the VMware technology allows for some APIs which can offload operations so that you don't necessarily need to have to install agents on every machine. The agentless approach of backup can really offload the necessity of having an agent in each machine so that you can centrally manage without having to install agents on every single virtual machine.
Right, and we'll talk a little bit more about migration in the mix there as well, because it's a natural part of evolving to an all-virtual infrastructure. In terms of strategies for recovering from a virtual machine, we want to get that application back. We'll also talk about getting the whole host back as well, which is something that's important to consider. There's a couple different options that folks have. Now, I think the traditional one on the far right, traditional full restore, folks understand what that is. You take a full backup of whatever it is. The time to recover it is naturally going to be the slowest because it's not using any new techniques or advanced technologies there, and you're free to keep as many versions as you want. Maybe before we talk about each one of the columns specifically, talk a little bit about the considerations that are the rows, things around time to recovery and number of versions, and how people can think about a data protection strategy for virtual machines.
When you look at your infrastructure, you have to think about what's the purpose of these machines and what is important about these machines. Some machines, they could be down for a certain amount of time and you don't have to worry about them, so you're okay with that. Some machines need to, in which case you have to think about how long it takes to get that machine back up and running. An Exchange server, for example, if it goes down, you probably need that up and running as fast as possible. On the other hand, a print server could take a little longer to be recovered and not necessarily impact the business. So you have to look at the purpose of these servers and identify what is most important, what sort of recovery time objectives you need to meet for these machines.
In terms of number of versions, I want to ask you a question about that, because I think folks are used to keeping versions back through time, and there's, as we see comparing these different approaches, a replica VM, or more like replication, is one version that's continuously updated versus multiple versions of backup. Is this an either-or scenario, or would people potentially back up the same machine more than one way to protect from different types of scenarios?
That's a great question, Mario, and that's true. A lot of people will use both. They will perform a replica and also set up a backup job. The replica for the really quick recovery, and the backup job for the ability to go back in time for maybe a week or 2 weeks old backup, maybe a specific file that they want to have access to from 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, and starting to dive into the differences here, one of the things that's the same, I think each approach that's here leverages those VMware APIs you talked about and has change block tracking associated with that. For the folks who may not know what that is, can you give us an explanation of that particular capability within VMware?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, VMware gives a technology that is able to identify what blocks have changed while the machine is running, so that backup vendors such as Acronis can, instead of identify what has changed by doing some I/O operations on the virtual disk, can actually access this CBT file to identify what blocks have changed. This really enhances performance so that when an incremental takes place, it will be drastically faster than if CBT was not there.
Mm. In terms of the space associated with it, I don't think CBT is a part of that, but if we look at the bottom row, encryption, deduplication, compression, those sorts of things are available for running a VM from backup as a quick recovery, or the traditional full restore mode, but it's not available on replication. Is that what's driving the large disk space compared to the smaller ones for the other two approaches?
The large disk space has to do with the fact that when you do a replica, you really have a copy, a clone of the original VM just on standby. So that means that the amount of space required is exactly the same as the original machine. Mm-hmm. In the other two methods, we actually store the backup in a backup file to which we can compress and dedupe and encrypt, which allows you to save on storage and also obviously have encryption for security purposes.
That's great. And so I think having a choice is really a good thing. It used to be just learn one. And I know that sometimes having choices can make things more complicated. But in this case, it's not very complicated to set some of these things up. You can choose to do one or even multiple things for each of your virtual machines and still have it be easy to use. Have you found that folks are able to take advantage of these things fairly easily as they make the transition to virtualization?
Yes, it's very easy. And really, there's only two choices when you create the actual job, whether you want to perform a replica or whether you want to do a traditional image level capture of the machine. Mm-hmm. Then the run VM from backup and traditional full restores are options that you select when you perform the actual recovery. So it just gives you two different tool sets. You can perform the run VM from backup, and if that's working adequately, you're good. And if not, you can go to the traditional full restore.
Great. Well, in terms of RTOs and RPOs, recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, using disk for backup provides for better measures in those regards versus tape or some sort of other media there. So it makes sense to include disk as a part of the overall technology architecture. And looking a little bit more at the basic architecture, what you're likely to need if you want to do a Landfree virtual machine backup with VMware, you're going to have some servers, your network, and if you have multiple sites, you might already have a WAN in place to carry out this particular solution. You're going to need reliable storage, and having it as a lower cost tier than the primary storage you're currently using makes for a more effective backup strategy and a more cost-effective solution overall. Adding to that benefit would be those deduplication and compression capabilities you talked about, Jerome, that you're going to want to look for when sourcing a virtual machine backup solution. Now, in terms of Landfree direct from the shared storage, can you talk a little bit about that technology and the benefits that are there versus choosing the old-fashioned way of doing it?
So the Landfree approach is an approach where the backups data, the data that you write to the backup file, instead of moving across the wire, across the network, would move across your iSCSI network or your fiber network. This minimizes the impact of the backup on your production architecture, so that way if you have machines that are getting backed up, you don't impact the performance of your Exchange server or your SQL server or whichever other server that you have in your environment, so that you have best performance. The benefit also is by doing Landfree, you tend to get better performance because you're isolating the traffic on the backup side from the other things going on in the network. So you tend to get better performance than if you were doing a LAN approach to backup.
And this diagram may not perfectly depict it. It tries to do it at a very high level. We have this local area network abstracted to a single cloud on the left-hand side of the diagram. In best practices, Jerome, most folks would have their client-server network on one end be a different VLAN or a different switch altogether, or maybe a different physical network, than the back-end iSCSI LAN. So while in the iSCSI world, you are using an IP network, a local area network, you'd still have it be LAN-free in the sense it's not going over the client-server network. It's just going across that dedicated VLAN or the dedicated set of switches that make up your iSCSI IP network, correct?
Exactly. Yep.
All right, and your backup server, as we show here, can be a physical machine or a virtual machine. We'll talk a little bit more about whether or not a virtual appliance makes sense depending on your size, and for a lot of smaller organizations, it can. And like everything virtual, you can set it up with a lot of different settings there on your LAN to take advantage of best practices as far as how to deploy that. So let's talk a little bit more about the requirements. Certainly, recovery is more important than the backup. So we'll talk a little bit more about bare metal versus just plain file restore. And when it comes to recovery, if you can separate the dependency on a very specific type of machine or hardware, certainly it's going to make it a whole lot easier. So one of the reasons I like VM Protect, Jerome, having used it here in our labs, is that not only is the install quick and easy, but it is a quick and easy product. And I think everybody always says that, hey, their stuff's always easy. We at Drobo certainly say that, and a lot of folks, when they experience it, they certainly agree. What are some of the things that folks want to think about when it comes to making sure that it's easy? Because the easier it is, the more repeatable it's going to be, the higher confidence you're going to have and be able to recover.
Well, an easy interface is really something where you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time figuring out where to click, where to find the operations. Also being able to have a flexible medium to access the interface. In the case of VM Protect, you can go to a web browser, go to the web page, in about 3 clicks you can have a backup or recovery going. And this is really, really powerful in the fact that you don't need to do a lot. In a few clicks you can do everything. You could even go to your VI client, connect to Virtual Center, and then perform backup and recovery operations directly from Virtual Center interface. So really it takes away the complexity of having to learn another product, having to perform a lot of thinking, because any click you're going to have to think about, why are you doing this? Is this the right click? And taking away all these complexities, making it easier for the user is really what you have to think about when you look at a product.
Managing Drobo storage is also as easy as following traffic lights. So a lot of folks love that about our interface too, though we do have a really good-looking GUI that you use for the provisioning and such. Around procedures, I'll admit, Jerome, when I was in IT, we used to constantly update our run books on how to recover from particular failure scenarios. And one of the things I dreaded about deploying new hardware was that I'd have to go back and update all those procedures. How is that today in the virtual world? Has that gotten better? And can your backup software help you in the procedures area, make it a lot more streamlined, and keep you from having to do a lot of that same planning up front? Because I think that's pretty important for smaller organizations doing VMware. They don't have the time to really invest in those procedures.
So there's a few things that will make that process a lot easier. One of them is something that we call disaster recovery plan. And what it is, it's a one-page documentation on how to recover a system. Every single time you perform a backup of your system, you get an email explaining how to recover that system if you need to recover from it. It's step by step telling you exactly what to click on, where to go, and what to do to get the system up and running. So that really simplifies the management and having to create new documentation on recovery procedure in the environment. I've had to create these in the past, and in some cases it can take hours, if not days, to update the documentation. When you build a new server, you have to create the new recovery plan. You have to create all the new documentation on how to get to the server, and that can be a very time-consuming process.
Yeah, it's almost always out of date about shortly after you do your first backup, it seems. So having that automated set of recovery plans that come out after each backup really is a cool feature. Let's talk about leveraging some of the technology and overcoming some of the top concerns, because I think cost of protecting an expanding data set is something people are worried about, and that's why I think with disk-based backup, it's less expensive than it has been in the past. And with technologies like deduplication and compression built in, you are getting very efficient use of that resource. So when you add it all up, it's not just the time savings and the better service levels, but you can actually spend less money by going with a solution like that. Complexity, I think we talked about around the recovery, but let's talk about evolving from physical to virtual, because the process of going from physical to virtual is something that's quite interesting. There was an Acronis study that I saw recently, Jerome, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, that talked about the smaller organizations making the change from 0% to 100% virtualized much more faster than larger ones. Certainly if the larger organizations were first in to use a virtualization, but now that it's quite mainstream, folks are going from 0 to 100% much more quickly. Now, getting there can still be a challenge. What are some of the ways that you can leverage your VMware backup solution to also help you get migrated to VMware?
I think the study you're referring to is a disaster recovery index that we run every year on environments. And that's true. The SMBs do seem to migrate a lot quicker, and if they have tools to do the migration, it can enhance the procedure. And one of the interesting things about backup technology is that if it works properly and you have a proper disaster recovery plan, you can use it for migrations as well. And this is a feature that we have in our product, which allows you to take, and it's actually a technology that we've had for a number of years now, probably about 5-6 years, which allows you to take a machine from one hardware to any other hardware. So as you migrate to VMware, one of the challenges is to have a reliable solution that will allow you to migrate. And the tool set, having an extra tool like the VM Protect tool that allows you to do this migration, can increase the efficiency of the migration process, so you can migrate even quicker to virtual and get all the savings from having a virtual environment that you can't get in the physical world.
Well, I brought it up because I think folks think of backup as something you do after you get your primary project done, getting the server infrastructure refreshed and migrated. But if you think about what you're going to use for backup even before you embark on that server consolidation project, you can leverage some of that technology that makes that project easier, which is why I wanted to bring it up, and that's kind of cool. Let's talk about disk imaging specifically in bare metal restore. This is something that hasn't been easy for a long time, and I think everybody talked about it. There was a lot of hype about maybe 10, 15 years ago. It died down a little bit, but the technology around bare metal restore can have a lot of powerful use cases here when it comes to the virtual machine and VMware infrastructure. So talk about how this can allow you to back up not just VMs, but the ESXi or ESX host, which is more protection than just the VMs themselves.
So this is something that is a very interesting technology, because when you think about disk imaging, you can think about just the guests themselves, the VMs, and yes, you could recover that onto a new host, but on top of that, if you do have a true disaster, you will also need to get the host back up and running. Mm-hmm. So disk imaging technology can also allow you to back up the host itself. And the way it works is really a two-step process. First, you get the backup, you send the backup of the ESX host and also the virtual machine, and then when the recovery time comes, you get a brand new machine, new hardware, boot it from a type of media, point to the location where the backup is done. It will recover the ESXi host and then recover the VMs. When the process is done, you have your whole system, your whole environment exactly copied as it was when the initial backup took place. So this really makes the process to be up and running as easy as possible. It will allow you to have some flexibility as far as the hardware, so that you don't need to have the exact same hardware, and it will really make the amount of stress that you might have in a disaster recovery scenario be as small as possible.
And that's what's great. It's almost two-in-one protection there in that it addresses the host themselves, which I like. And it says here that it automatically creates documentation of the steps to recover, which is that great feature you talked about before. Part of making it easily, but also getting the full power of this bare metal restore, which is why disk imaging technology can still be interesting. It's not a physical server only thing. There are physical machines still in the virtual world, so that's something that's cool to keep in mind as we're looking at the technology. How about replication? We talked about earlier that it's not an or function. You can use both and choose to use both depending on your application. Talk a little bit about how the replication works here, because it does provide for that faster recovery, but it's not necessarily more complicated.
No, it's very easy to configure. It's essentially you have to select two things. Which machine do you want to replicate, and where do you want it replicated? And what it will do is it will create a second virtual machine that's an exact copy of the original one into a different data store, different host. So that way you have a copy of the VM. If the original one stops working in blue screens or maybe data corruption, you can perform a failover procedure where you turn on the replica VM. And once the VM is up, you have the copy and you're up and running. This really makes the recovery process simple in that you don't have to do a recovery. The machine is already in standby mode. All you have to do is power it on, and then you're up and running.
That is cool. And with disk-based backup, one of the reasons why Drobo recommends iSCSI SAN as the means of doing your storage for the disk-based backup is it provides then that platform for replicating VMs and running VMs off of that infrastructure. Do you see folks using this replication to help with test dev, or would they just do a more traditional backup and recover that if they want to do some testing? Are there pros and cons to using either, or do they both work for test dev?
They both work with test dev. I see more people using it for production environment, in fact, but you could definitely use this technology for testing and dev purposes, especially when you have flexible storage to store these virtual machines.
Yeah, no doubt they're using it for production. That's true. I was just thinking that a lot of times in a smaller organization, they don't have a lot of hardware. They don't have a lot of time, so anything that they can leverage that they're using in production also to help them out with test dev can be something that's good for them. So hey, thanks for the information there. Let's talk a little bit about that migration. I personally think this is an important capability when it comes to the transition to virtualization, but also just in general, that you're going to be doing virtual to virtual migrations as well, so that you're always in a constant state of evolution. So maybe you can give us an idea from your experience working with smaller organizations, how they go about using the migration that's built up into the backup technology.
What a lot of customers will end up doing is create an initial image of their initial machine, the physical machine, and then recover it onto a virtual environment. And this will configure, create the new virtual machine, put it into the environment. And when the procedure is done, you have an exact copy of the original machine, so everything is exactly the same. You're up and running. You can then make sure the machine is up and running properly. Once you've checked that everything's okay, you would probably delete or repurpose that physical hardware. And once you have everything in the virtual machine, you then can use the same solution to create the backup of the environment. And then again, use the same solution for the recoveries, because in the end, the backup is nice, but the recovery is more important.
Absolutely. Let's look then at how you might put this solution together. If you're in the market for enhancing your current VMware backup architecture, if you're not doing anything, and studies show that 1/3 of customers back up their virtual machines less often than they do their physical machines, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't have to be that way. A product like Acronis VM Protect 7 is affordably priced and pretty straightforward in terms of the way you would purchase it, because it's on a per CPU, per socket basis at a good cost. It's one of the reasons why pairing it up with Drobo iSCSI SAN storage makes a lot of sense, because like the Acronis VM Protect solution, Drobo iSCSI SAN is affordable and easy to use in comparison to some of the other technologies that are out there. We would recommend our iSCSI storage because it's more flexible in a VMware environment and allows you to do more things with it. It's also VMware Ready certified as a solution there. And one of the things that folks are often concerned about, Jerome, because they're used to paying a little bit more for some of this extra stuff, so to speak, is things like deduplication and the migration, encryption, compression. All that stuff's built into VM Protect. There's really no other additional licenses they need to worry about?
That's right. That's right. So it's one license and it includes everything. So we kept it as simple as possible so that you don't have this, oh, you need this other low version that you need to upgrade to a different license. So it's kept as simple as possible.
And we didn't talk about Exchange or other applications in detail, but conceivably there's applications like Exchange running on some of these virtual machines. We show them here in the little diagram there of how us having it run there in the lower left-hand corner. You can still do pretty granular level restorations with Exchange without buying any additional licenses, right?
Yeah. So with the VM Protect 7, it's Exchange aware. So not only can you recover the full Exchange server, but on top of that, you can extract a specific email or mailbox from the Exchange server. And that comes at no additional cost. That's
great. Well, if you want to take more advantage of this, we have some additional resources we'll talk about here at the end of the program. Let me hit you with a couple quick questions, Jerome, before we finish here. Virtual appliance, the idea of having it run as yet another VM on your VMware infrastructure. You can do that. It would share some of the hardware resources, or you can do a Windows physical server installation, maybe one of those retired old physical servers. I think backup folks, at least historically, have always been handed down some of their hardware there. When looking at one versus the other, do you have any thoughts around what a smaller organization might do? Because they're smaller, does a virtual appliance generally always fit, or are there times when they want to think about using a Windows server as the VM Protect backup machine?
In terms of ease of use, the virtual appliance seemed to be the most popular option. I think around 60 or 65% of our users tend to use a virtual appliance. On the other hand, if you do use the Drobo iSCSI storage, you can also connect that to a iSCSI storage network on a physical machine, in which case you'd have Windows installed on the physical machine, in which case the Windows Server installation will give you the best performance because you will offload the traffic to iSCSI and not impact the production network.
Right. So we tend at Drobo to recommend the second door or the Windows physical server for that very same reason. Not only is it Landfree, but you can really isolate it there. And for a lot of folks, they might have a server that's left over. The hardware requirements on this aren't very large, are they?
No, they're very small. It's 512 megs of RAM and a dual-core machine. So it's
the type of stuff that most people might have around. But if you don't have one, certainly a virtual appliance is one way to go about doing that. Now, every time you use the word backup, Jerome, folks want to know about off-site backup and backup to cloud. I know that you have some solutions that work great with backing up to cloud, but assuming someone had a second site and they put some other infrastructure out there, do you need additional software or do you need some other things in the mix in order to write your backups directly to an off-site location? Or for a smaller organization that has a decent-sized pipe, does the compression and dedupe built in work well enough that they can look to do that directly to their off-site?
So when you think of an off-site location, first of all, our software definitely can get the data off-site or can leverage storage to move the data off-site. The deduplication compression technology will shrink the size required for the backup. Mm-hmm. You can also do something that we call a seed process, where you can put that backup file into some type of media, transport it physically to the off-site location, and then push incremental data over the wire to that location. So that way you only send the new data and you don't have the initial terabyte or hundreds of gigs that you have to send over the network.
Or even 10 terabytes. We have a lot of customers, Jerome, that buy Drobos and they have a lot of storage. I personally fly about the country and the world with 20 terabytes of storage in the overhead bin compartment. So that seating certainly does help. A Drobo being small, you can seat it locally, transport that to keep the vast majority of that initial seating off of your WAN, and then use, as you mentioned, the WAN to maintain the incremental. So that's a great solution for folks who are looking at doing that. Thanks for sharing that information. All right, folks, if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to take those online right now. But while we wait for those, I'll give you our key takeaways. VMware, as a technology, has been great for smaller organizations. But as with anything that's new, there are some things that need to be thought of differently. And the best type of technology for disk-based backup certainly is going to be technology that's built for virtualization, leveraging CBT, change block tracking, and providing some of those other capabilities that you'd think of would be an enterprise-only type solution, but are existing now even for smaller organizations. So Drobo's iSCSI SAN plus the Acronis VM Protect 7 solution together really does provide a low-cost alternative for VMware Backup. And with that, I definitely want to thank you, Jerome, for hanging out with us on today's call. A question we have here is, do you do virtual to virtual, but can you do physical to virtual? I think we answered that. But how about virtual back to physical? Is that ever something that someone's ever asked for? And would VM Protect be able to do that, or would you need to use the Acronis Backup and Recovery 11 product to do the virtual to physical?
That's a very interesting question. In the SMB market, typically that's fairly a rare use case for a server to need to go back from virtual back to physical. Mm-hmm. So in the case of VM Protect, for the most part, people tend to do physical to virtual migration or virtual to virtual. Mm-hmm. We do have a separate product called Acronis Backup and Recovery 11, which could allow you to do the reverse migration. But in a lot of cases for VM Protect, once you migrate to virtual, you really don't have the need to move it back to physical. Mm-hmm. The cases where people have had the need to go back to physical is usually when the environment fluctuates a lot, or if they need to get support for an application that does not support running as a virtual machine.
Right.
And these days there are less and less of these applications. Virtualization really is the trend in the market. And most application vendors now do support running as a virtual machine.
Nonetheless, a great question about those combinations. So the answer is, with VM Protect, you are covered for the physical to virtual as well as virtual to virtual. And that includes if you were running a free version and you want to migrate onto a paid-for version. That's something you can help out with. People don't think of that as being a labor-intensive process, but that could be something that would incur a little bit more downtime than you might want. VM Protect's good for that use case as well, right?
Absolutely, yep.
All right, so with a Drobo solution and disk-based backup, certainly there are some capacity limitations theoretically. What about eliminating tape altogether with the idea of it lasting 7 years, because a lot of people have some regulatory compliance there? Do you see people, Jerome, mixing disk-based backup with tape where they use disk for the vast majority of their retention policy, so to speak, so they can make very, very fast recoveries, but for long-term archiving using tape, or with dedupe and the ability to scale disks over time, are folks looking at disk as being the ability to do both of those things?
Well, these days it seems like people tend to try to get away from tape as much as possible, especially in the SMB space. And with Drobo storage and deduplication, you really can minimize the amount of storage you need and have a flexible solution where you could actually keep backups for a long period of time, even 7 years worth, as long as you set retention rules to not keep every day's worth, because you probably don't need every day's worth from 7 years ago.
Right.
Usually 7 years ago, you probably keep maybe monthlies or every quarter a version of that backup. And you pair that with a flexible storage device like Drobo and deduplication, and you really can get that performance without having to use tape as the type of medium.
Well, we don't ever want to talk bad about any technology. All technologies have their place, and I think that ongoing, we never at Drobo tell folks to get rid of their tape library if they specifically don't want to. It can be good for those monthly fulls, and it can be good for taking some things off-site, like the replication versus backup that we discussed earlier, Jerome. I think it's an and function. You can and should keep your monthly fulls on disk as well, because unlike a tape, which is sitting at rest and could degrade and fail, I won't be the first one to ever say that a tape didn't restore when someone tried. A Drobo being online archive will continuously scrub that data, ensure that the data is good. It'll move data around off marginalized areas of disks and avoid soft sector errors because of the way it works. So you're going to get some better reliability there. And with less than 100 watts of power usage, it's certainly a great investment to keep that all online. So thanks for giving us your view on how folks tend to balance out tape versus disk. I'd agree with you. Disk tends to be where the market is going there. Looking at another question here. If you're replicating VMs over the web, can they live fail over to a remote location in the event of a total site loss? Speaking specifically to the replication capability built into VM Protect. What are the more common scenarios of people doing this, replicating between two sites? Is it more for an on-site replication and quick recovery, or is it suitable also for recovery at an off-site location?
So you can definitely use a replication to an off-site location for failover purposes, and you could do a failover. The one thing that would be very wary about is you don't necessarily want to have an automated failover. There's always the problem of not knowing when a failover actually needs to take place. So usually they're user triggered, where a user realizes the server is down, and at which point you initiate that failover process.
Got it. Hey, well, some great information as always. I love having you on the program, Jerome, because of your expertise. For folks who want a little bit more information on VM Protect as a solution, we'll have our assets posted on our website at drobo.com/VMProtect for you to get access to them, a solution summary, how-to guide, these slides in PDF form, as well as replay of today's broadcast. If you want to try it out, which is one of the best ways to see for yourself how easy it can be, there is a 15-day free trial available on the Acronis website where you can download VM Protect there. In terms of folks getting more information from you, Jerome, folks can get us on live chat on our Drobo site. We also have live demos that go every day at drobo.com/live. But if they want to get a hold of you guys over at Acronis, getting you on Twitter looks like it's a good way, or the Acronis info site is another way that they can get a hold of other folks from Acronis. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a great source for information where you can get a lot of information about virtual machines, physical machines, basically anything about the Acronis products.
Fantastic. With that, I want to thank everyone for your participation. We look forward to seeing you next time on the Drobo Broadcast Network. Thanks again, Jerome. Thanks again for being on the program.
Thank you, Mario.
All right, cheers, everyone, and the best of luck in your endeavors, continuing to evolve your SMB IT architecture. Mario Blendi from Drobo signing off. We'll see you next time.